Why do some people work harder every year, yet become financially smaller? Same education, same salary, same intelligence. 10 years later, one builds assets that compound quietly in the background, while the other builds experience, credentials, and exhaustion. What if the difference is not discipline, not knowledge, not ambition, but incompatibility? What if certain personalities are structurally misaligned with how wealth is actually created? Da Vinci understood something most modern professionals ignore. Systems reward alignment, not effort. And if your internal architecture is incompatible with wealth-building systems, no amount of grinding will save you. The most dangerous part is this. The incompatible personality feels responsible, rational, even strategic. It does not feel broken, it feels intelligent. That is why it persists. You may be carrying it right now without knowing it. Most people assume wealth is a function of intensity. Work longer, learn more, save harder, optimize spending. This advice assumes the problem is behavioral. It assumes everyone is operating from the same psychological foundation and simply needs better habits. That assumption is false. Two individuals can execute identical behaviors and produce radically different financial outcomes because the architecture behind the behavior determines its effectiveness. The incompatible personality does not fail from laziness. It fails from misalignment. It approaches wealth-building systems with a psychology designed for stability, not uncertainty. It seeks emotional reassurance before financial exposure. It prioritizes internal comfort over external positioning. On the surface, this looks disciplined. Underneath, it creates systematic exclusion from the very environments where wealth compounds. Da Vinci observed that some minds could move decisively within ambiguity, while others required clarity before motion. History rewarded the former. The latter were praised for caution. Wealth does not reward praise, it rewards placement. I call this the wealth incompatibility pattern. It is not a flaw. It is not a moral weakness. It is a structural mismatch between personality architecture and wealth-building mechanics. Wealth-building systems operate under uncertainty. Markets fluctuate. Businesses evolve. Opportunities emerge briefly and disappear. The incompatible personality demands certainty before action. It wants validation before commitment. It wants guarantees before exposure. This demand feels prudent, it feels intelligent, but it creates a delay cycle that compounds invisibly over time. While the compatible personality enters markets with calculated positioning and adjusts through feedback, the incompatible personality remains in analysis, preparing for a future moment of clarity that rarely arrives. The tragedy is not that it avoids risk. The tragedy is that it avoids asymmetry. Wealth is built through asymmetrical positioning, limited downside, expansive upside, repeated over time. The incompatible mind filters out these opportunities because they feel psychologically uncomfortable. Robert Greene wrote about how humans sabotage themselves through unconscious patterns they interpret as virtues. The incompatible personality believes it is being responsible. In reality, it is protecting its emotional state at the cost of its financial trajectory. If this resonates with you, subscribe. This channel builds architecture, not motivation. Here is where the pattern becomes visible. The wealth incompatibility pattern is fueled by certainty addiction. The incompatible personality does not consciously avoid wealth. It avoids psychological discomfort. It confuses uncertainty with danger. It interprets volatility as threat instead of opportunity. This creates a behavioral loop. Research longer, wait for confirmation. Seek one more opinion, delayed execution. The individual feels productive because analysis feels like progress. But analysis without exposure produces no compounding. Markets reward capital at risk, not opinions formed. Careers reward positioning, not preparation alone. Businesses reward entry, not endless evaluation. The incompatible personality demands clarity before commitment, yet clarity in wealth-building environments often appears only after commitment. Da Vinci did not wait for perfect conditions to experiment. He entered complexity and adjusted from within it. The incompatible mind stands outside the arena, studying it, waiting for a moment when uncertainty disappears. That moment never comes. The delay feels responsible. The delay compounds into invisibility. This is the uncomfortable part. Discipline can become camouflage. The incompatible personality often displays exceptional discipline in areas that do not generate wealth. It tracks expenses meticulously. It reads financial books. It listens to market commentary. It refines budgeting systems. It feels engaged in wealth building. But the critical act, capital deployment under uncertainty, is postponed repeatedly. Discipline becomes a substitute for exposure. The individual says, "I am preparing." Years pass in preparation. Meanwhile, compatible personalities make imperfect decisions, absorb temporary volatility, and accumulate position. The difference is not intelligence, it is structural tolerance for asymmetry. Wealth is built by entering systems where outcomes are probabilistic, not guaranteed. The incompatible personality requires emotional reassurance before movement. That reassurance rarely exists in asymmetric environments. So it waits. And while it waits, time compounds for someone else. Which pattern do you recognize in yourself? The wealth incompatibility pattern operates through three structural filters. First is perceptual distortion. The incompatible personality overestimates downside and underestimates asymmetry. It sees volatility and interprets instability rather than opportunity. Second is temporal misalignment. It prioritizes short-term emotional comfort over long-term statistical advantage. It would rather feel secure today than positioned tomorrow. Third is execution paralysis. The demand for excessive certainty delays entry into wealth-building systems where early positioning matters most. These filters operate automatically. The individual does not wake up deciding to avoid wealth. They wake up deciding to be careful. Over time, careful becomes stagnant. Stagnant becomes predictable. Predictable becomes financially average. The system does not punish them dramatically, it simply excludes them quietly. That exclusion compounds invisibly for years before becoming undeniable. Consider Sarah's story: six-figure income, intelligent, methodical. She analyzes investment vehicles for months. She waits for confirmation from economists, analysts, articles, and social proof. Each delay feels justified. Each hesitation feels intelligent. Meanwhile, her colleague enters the same markets with incomplete information but defined risk parameters. He understands that markets reward exposure with adjustment, not certainty before action. 5 years later, he holds appreciating assets. Sarah holds refined knowledge. Her incompatibility is subtle. She is not reckless. She is not lazy. She is structurally misaligned. She demands psychological safety before capital deployment. Markets do not provide psychological safety. They provide probabilistic rewards. Da Vinci did not require emotional certainty before experimentation. He understood that insight emerges from engagement, not observation alone. Sarah observes, others engage. Engagement compounds, observation informs. One builds position, the other builds understanding. Only one builds wealth. If this contrast feels uncomfortable, write one word below that describes the friction you feel. Here is the contradiction most people refuse to confront. The more responsible you feel about money, the more incompatible you might be with wealth. Responsibility feels noble. It feels disciplined. It feels mature. But if responsibility becomes risk aversion disguised as wisdom, it quietly blocks asymmetrical positioning. The incompatible personality optimizes for not losing rather than for compounding. It measures success by stability instead of expansion. That orientation protects the ego but limits exposure to environments where wealth multiplies. Discipline without asymmetry produces maintenance, not growth. Carefulness without positioning produces preservation, not accumulation. Ask yourself honestly, are you protecting capital or are you building leverage? The difference determines trajectory. Which side are you on? The Renaissance offers a brutal example. The merchant families of Florence operated in unstable markets, fluctuating trade routes, political volatility, and unpredictable alliances. They did not wait for perfect clarity before deploying capital. They entered uncertain environments with structured risk. Meanwhile, scholars and artisans demanded intellectual certainty before action. They sought clarity, safety, predictability. History admired the scholars. It enriched the merchants. Da Vinci moved among both worlds. He observed that mastery required engagement with ambiguity, not retreat from it. The compatible personalities entered systems and adapted. The incompatible personalities analyzed systems and hesitated. Wealth aligned itself accordingly. This pattern has not changed. Markets still reward structured exposure. They still ignore emotional preference. The system does not punish caution loudly. It simply compounds advantage for those who enter. Robert Greene observed that human beings defend their identity more aggressively than they pursue their potential. The wealth incompatibility pattern thrives inside that defense mechanism. The incompatible personality does not see itself as cautious. It sees itself as intelligent. It does not interpret delay as fear. It interprets delay as prudence. The blind spot is this. The system you are trying to win inside does not reward how careful you feel. It rewards exposure to asymmetry over time. Markets do not care about your internal logic. They respond to positioning. The incompatible mind filters out positioning because positioning requires psychological exposure. It demands tolerance for incomplete information. It requires decisions that may temporarily look wrong. The ego resists that environment, so the ego reframes avoidance as wisdom. That reframing compounds silently for years. This is not about intelligence, it is about identity rigidity. The wealth-compatible personality is not braver, it is structurally flexible. The incompatible personality lives inside what appears to be safety, stable job, conservative savings, predictable returns, low volatility. Everything looks controlled. But control is often an illusion purchased at the expense of asymmetry. A savings account feels safe because its value does not fluctuate dramatically. It also does not compound meaningfully. Waiting for market clarity feels intelligent. It also excludes you from early entry advantages. Demanding guaranteed outcomes feels responsible. It also eliminates most wealth-building strategies. The incompatible personality optimizes for predictability. Wealth-building systems optimize for statistical expansion under uncertainty. These two orientations collide. The system does not negotiate. It does not adapt to psychological preference. It continues rewarding those who accept probabilistic exposure. If you recognize this pattern in your own behavior, identify it clearly. Naming it reduces its power. Ignoring it compounds its cost. Here is the twist most people never consider. The wealth incompatibility pattern is not permanent. It is not genetic. It is not destiny. It is adaptive conditioning. You learned to prioritize certainty because certainty reduced stress. You learned to avoid volatility because volatility felt threatening. Those adaptations may have protected you socially or emotionally. But wealth building requires a different adaptation, calibrated exposure. The compatible personality does not eliminate caution, it disciplines it. It does not abandon analysis, it limits it. It does not chase risk blindly, it defines acceptable loss and moves anyway. The shift is subtle but decisive. Instead of asking, "Is this guaranteed?" it asks, "Is the downside defined and the upside asymmetric?" That single question restructures decision-making. That is where compatibility begins. The modern economy amplifies this divide. Information is abundant. Analysis tools are infinite. Data is everywhere. For the incompatible personality, this becomes fuel for paralysis. There is always another report to read, another forecast to examine, another expert to consult. Meanwhile, compatible personalities extract sufficient insight and move. They understand that speed with defined risk often outperforms perfection with delay. Technology rewards first movers in new environments. Venture capital rewards portfolio thinking. Markets reward time exposed, not time preparing. The incompatible personality misinterprets preparation as progress. But wealth compounds only when capital interacts with systems. Reflection informs, positioning multiplies. The gap between those two widens over decades into outcomes that look like luck, but are actually structural alignment. Now comes the part most people avoid. You cannot change what you refuse to confront. The wealth incompatibility pattern hides behind virtue. It hides behind responsibility. It hides behind intelligence. So the only way to break it is structural honesty. Ask yourself without emotion, do you consistently delay action until certainty appears? Do you consume more financial content than capital you deploy? Do you feel relief when you decide not to enter an uncertain opportunity? Relief is the signal. The incompatible personality feels safer when exposure disappears. The compatible personality feels aligned when exposure is defined and entered. This is not about being reckless. It is about measuring your psychological reaction to asymmetry. If uncertainty produces paralysis rather than calculation, you are not building wealth. You are protecting identity. And identity protection compounds in the opposite direction of capital growth. The wealth incompatibility pattern is not binary. It operates on a spectrum. At one end is full incompatibility. This personality demands certainty before exposure and avoids probabilistic environments entirely. At the next level is conditional incompatibility. Action occurs, but only until volatility appears. Then retreat follows. Further along is adaptive compatibility. Discomfort exists, but exposure proceeds within defined boundaries. Finally, structural alignment. Uncertainty is calculated, not feared. Where are you on that spectrum? Do you enter asymmetry and adjust, or do you hover at the edge waiting for emotional reassurance? The goal is not fearlessness, it is calibration. Self-awareness is the first structural correction. Wealth building conflicts with identity preservation more often than people admit. Many professionals unconsciously protect the image of being intelligent, cautious, and rational. Entering uncertain markets risks being wrong. That threat activates ego defense, so the mind reframes hesitation as wisdom. But ask yourself this, are you protecting capital or are you protecting self-image? The incompatible personality would rather appear intelligent than risk temporary error. Capital does not reward appearance, it rewards exposure repeated over time. Compatible personalities detach identity from outcome. A wrong move becomes data. Without that detachment, analysis becomes armor. and armor is heavy. Wealth is rarely built through linear effort. It is built through asymmetric positioning, limited downside, expansive upside, repeated exposure. Venture capital operates on this principle. Most bets fail. A few dominate. The incompatible personality evaluates each opportunity as if it must succeed independently. The compatible personality evaluates exposure across distributions. Which model are you using? Do you demand certainty per decision, or do you calculate expected value across repetition? Emotional comfort is not a metric. Statistical advantage is. That shift in measurement separates preservation from accumulation. The Medici family did not dominate Florence by avoiding uncertainty. They structured it. They diversified exposure, balanced alliances, and accepted volatility as the cost of expansion. Meanwhile, artisans relied on predictable income tied to stable demand. Stability felt safe. Diversification felt dangerous. Over decades, one compounded leverage, the other maintained livelihood. Da Vinci moved within merchant patronage, not cautious workshops. Why? Because exposure funded innovation. Ask yourself, are you building survival or are you building leverage? Survival sustains, leverage multiplies. Corporate careers mirror this divide. One professional optimizes for stable promotions and predictable raises. Another negotiates equity, commissions, or asymmetric upside. Both may work equally hard. One compounds security, the other compounds exposure. Which feels safer to you, and which produces disproportionate outcomes? Systems reward leverage, not comfort. The incompatible personality confuses predictability with strategy. Predictability stabilizes income. It rarely scales it. If you value structural thinking over emotional reassurance, subscribe. This channel examines architecture, not motivation. Clarity compounds when perspective sharpens. Structural compatibility requires deliberate rewiring. Begin by defining acceptable downside before entering opportunity. When downside is defined, fear loses abstraction. Next, limit analysis windows. How many decisions in your life have improved because you researched them for 6 additional months? Finally, measure exposure frequency instead of isolated outcomes. Did you enter the system, or did you stay outside refining theory? Repetition inside a symmetry builds familiarity. Familiarity reduces paralysis. Compatibility grows through disciplined exposure. Loss must be reframed. Temporary drawdowns are tuition within probabilistic systems. The incompatible personality interprets volatility as confirmation of danger. The compatible personality interprets it as participation cost. Which interpretation dominates your reactions? Markets fluctuate. Assets retrace, businesses cycle. Exposure remains the engine of compounding. If every fluctuation threatens identity, continuation becomes impossible. If fluctuation is contextualized as data, continuation becomes inevitable, and continuation is what compounds. Da Vinci did not demand certainty before experimentation. He sketched, tested, adjusted, repeated. Insight emerged from engagement, not observation alone. Wealth building mirrors this loop. Allocate, observe, refine, reallocate. Compatible personalities embrace iteration. Incompatible personalities stall before entry. Ask yourself, do you refine through participation or do you refine in theory? Flexibility compounds, rigidity preserves. Over decades, that difference becomes capital disparity. Pause. Where have you delayed action waiting for clarity that never arrived? Where have you chosen reassurance over asymmetry? Write one word below that describes your dominant tendency. Naming the pattern reduces its invisibility. Unnamed patterns persist. The wealth incompatibility pattern hides inside virtue, discipline, preparation, responsibility. But systems do not respond to virtue. They respond to structural alignment. You cannot negotiate with probabilistic environments using emotional preference. You must adapt architecture to system mechanics. So ask yourself honestly, are you building effort or are you building exposure? Effort exhausts when misaligned. Exposure compounds when structured. The divergence is subtle at first, then it becomes permanent. Compatibility is built, not inherited. The first shift is redefining risk. Risk is not volatility. Risk is an undefined downside. When downside is defined, exposure becomes a strategy. The second shift is redefining certainty. Certainty is not required before action. It is built through repetition inside the system. The third shift is redefining loss. A temporary drawdown is not failure. It is feedback inside probabilistic environments. Da Vinci did not demand certainty before experimentation. He entered complexity, adjusted, refined, and repeated. That is structural flexibility. The wealth-compatible personality develops the same approach. Define the downside, enter, adjust, repeat. Over time, repetition inside asymmetry compounds into disproportionate outcomes. The incompatible personality waits for clarity. The compatible personality builds it through exposure. That is the divide. The wealth incompatibility pattern feels intelligent. That is why it survives. It convinces you that preparation equals positioning, that safety equals strategy, that caution equals wisdom. But wealth-building systems operate independently of your internal comfort. They reward defined exposure, statistical patience, and structural alignment. So the question is no longer whether you work hard. It is whether your architecture aligns with asymmetry. Effort without compatibility produces fatigue. Compatibility without perfection produces compounding. Over decades, that difference becomes irreversible. Are you building effort or are you building architecture? The answer determines not how busy you feel, but how wealthy you become. And there you have it, the personality type that never becomes wealthy. If this breakdown sharpened your thinking, continue with the next video. It will take you further. Support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Stay sharp. Stay intentional. Keep shaping your wealth the way Da Vinci shaped his work. Patiently, deliberately, and with an understanding of the rules that govern results. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next video.